Hello and welcome! In this video, I will show you how we render content in the storefront. That means how content that is configured for a landing page arrives in the storefront. Because everything I see here, this big teaser, images, text, or this grid, the two columns of text, the product tiles, everything has to be configured and maintained somewhere. It has to be implemented in the storefront. To do this, we jump into the Makaira dashboard, more precisely into the Makaira page editor, which we find here in the top left menu. First of all, if this is the first time you hear about the page editor and thought, "I've never heard of that," then I highly recommend you to visit the Makaira documentation and read through the page editor. Then you'll get a good insight into what the page editor is and what you can do with it. As usual, you can find the link to this in the video description. But let's go back to the page editor and search for the starting page that we are currently editing. Now we see the starting page, and in the preview on the right, it looks like the page we just saw locally, which means we are on the right page. And now I would like to show, on the left in the content area, that we can see different content that has been placed. For example, the teaser hero that I have here, or a teaser grid that I have a little further down. These different images, a promotion, a text with several columns, or a product teaser. Of course, I can also rearrange this content if I want to. Just like that, and then I can see what it looks like. I can undo it as well. Just an example of your possibilities. But now, somehow this content has to end up in the storefront. Before that, an information on the side. What exactly these components are and how I can maintain different components, how you can create your own components, is going to be in another video. In this video, I'm going to show you the general flow of data from Makaira to the storefront. However, before that, I want to give you some more technical understanding. We go back to the dashboard, and then for the page editor, click on the component editor entry at the bottom left. This is where you can configure the components for the page editor. I have an entry, a configuration, for each of the components that I can use in the page editor. But, as I said, how it works will be in a different video. The only important thing for us at the moment is that each component or each template of a component needs a unique identifier. In this case, for example, for the hero teaser. That's the element that we saw at the top has the ID teaser-hero. This is the information that we also need in the storefront to know which content element has which React component as equivalent. Because everything we see here, this big teaser banner or this grid or the text, all the content that we actually display is all implemented in the form of React components. So you can imagine that every component that you create and maintain in Makaira Page Editor has a counterpart as a React component. And what it looks like in the code is where we're heading next. So let's jump back into the editor, and we'll start where we left off last time, which is in entry.js, where we rendered the page component. If you remember last video, I showed you how you can use the page type to determine which React component should be used for the landing page. Let's jump back to the page components object and recall this was the landing page component for the type page, and we'll now take a more detailed look at it. We can see that there's not that much to see, meaning not that much is happening here. And only two things are relevant for us. The first is the pageData on line 7, which we get from a hook that is called useGlobalData. That's a hook which refers to a context that we use to have a certain kind of state handling globally. For example, to hold the page data in the global state so we don't have to pass the page data through all components via properties, or worse, to refetch that data. To illustrate this briefly, let's dive into the entry.js and scroll down to the render method. We see that our application is wrapped by many providers, which is actually this area, with the layout header, the page component, and the footer. Those providers are FE, the global data provider, to hold this global data, also a translation provider that we use to translate, and two other providers. If you look deeper into it, it's all just React context. In addition, the providers provide us with hooks. If you're new to the concept of React, context, and hooks, I definitely recommend checking out the React documentation again. You can find the links below the video description. Then we head back to the landing page and know we got the page data with the hook. We remember that we initially received the page data when we fetched the page data from Makaira, when the page was rendered for the first time. That's where they come from, and we can now continue to use them in the client because we applied them to the state beforehand. Next, we need to look at what we're going to do with that data. In fact, the page data contains everything that relates to the page, including the maintained content. I can find this under pageData.data.config, and there I have two areas, top and bottom. And in these top and bottom areas are arrays of objects. And now you might wonder what is top and bottom here, and why is there a product list in between? These are features that are not so relevant for us at this point. The fact is, you can theoretically maintain a product list for a landing page and then decide whether I want content to be placed above or below the list. Since we don't use it in this case, only line 16 is important for us, in which we simply render the content elements from the top area from top to bottom. To show you what this elements array looks like, I will briefly take a look with you at the data structure. I will output it via console log so that I can reload the page briefly, and then we will see what we get here at terminal level. And we see this is an array of objects, and each object corresponds to a maintained content element in the page editor. From top to bottom, we see teaser hero, teaser grid, promotion, multi-column text, and products. This is pretty much exactly how we maintained it in Page Editor, as it is shown here from top to bottom. And you remember, I just showed you the component editor, where we assigned the identifier teaser-hero. This one is also included here in the key component. In addition, this entry object also has properties. This simply requires some metadata, such as whether it is active or not, for which user groups it should be displayed, and the content that is actually displayed. And in this case again, we won't get finished rendered HTML. We just get the raw data, which we then later technically use as properties for the React component. That's about it for the data structure. I'll close this again, remove this console log, and we'll take a look at what's actually happening here. We render a content elements component and pass the elements data to the component as property. Let's take a look at that. We find something that looks and works similarly or even the same as what we saw in entry.js. Remember, in the entry.js, we determined the page component using a mapping. We knew, okay, we have a type that we use as a key to determine in page components object, which reference to which React component we want to have. We use the same approach for the content itself. We have a big object named components where the key is the identifier. The same identifier I maintained in the Makaira component editor. And the value is then a React component, or better, the reference to a component. And that's what we are using in the return down here. In line 40, we are iterating over the array elements. You can see that it is an array if you take a quick look at line 19, where we read elements from the properties. We see that we assign an array as the default value. That is a typical convention we follow in the Storefront. Whenever we read properties, we also assign a default value to show the developer, hey, this is going to be an array, not an object or anything else. With that piece of information, the developer knows what methods and functionalities he can use. Of course, if I have no content to display, then the length of the array is 0 and only null will be returned. But in this example, we are assuming that we have some content to display. Meaning, now we can actually map our elements array, and for every entry, we have to look up which React component we want to render. We know, as we have just seen, that every entry we have right now has a key component whose value corresponds to the identifier from Makaira. This means that we are doing something that we already know from the entry.js. We go to the components object and call the key that corresponds to the value of the component. We know that the identifier teaser-hero corresponds with the teaser hero. It's this one. And then we return the reference to the teaser hero React component. In this case, component is simply a reference to the teaser hero component. If we don't have anything there, for example, if I maintain a component in Makaira for which we have no equivalent here, then we have no value and return 0. Which means for this entry, even if I maintain something for this value in Makaira, we won't show anything in the Storefront. But now we know that something is there, which means that we return the reference for the teaser hero, provide the content as properties, and destructure the whole data set so that the content itself, the raw data, is passed to the component as properties. And just to show what happens if an entry is missing, we briefly delete this key from the object, save it, and see that it has already disappeared. Why did this happen and I didn't have to reload? Quite simply, because we have a browser sync with the Storefront if you run the Storefront in development mode. In case you code something, you usually don't need to go back into the browser itself and reload, but the storefront updates itself. So here we see that the Teaser Hero banner is no longer visible, although I maintained it in the page editor, but when I undo the deletion, I see it's back. It is important to know that when you create a new component in Makaira that is not available by default, you must definitely add this mapping in this contents element array, because otherwise the storefront won't know what to do with that entry. And that brings us to the end of the video. As a recap, I showed you how we get the data from Makaira, which we maintain in the page editor, into the storefront, and how we map the object to convert the individual content elements that are maintained in the page editor into the corresponding React components. In the next video, I will show you how to work with the components in more detail, how you can create a component yourself, how you can configure it, how you can define an API for it, how you can define a UI in the page editor, and of course, how you can build the corresponding React component in the front end itself. On that note, I hope you enjoyed it, and see you in the next video.